it's shocking, it's shamefully despicable to see the administration of the United States of America basically parroting the Kremlin's propaganda narrative. Every dictatorship ends. Every autocratic regime falls.
Were you not afraid that they were going to kill you?
I was certain I was going to die in that Siberian prison. Fear is a natural human sentiment, but this is what feeds these dictatorial regimes. I have absolutely no doubt that Russia will be a democracy. I have absolutely no doubt that I will be back in my home country, and I think it's going to happen much sooner than people may think about it today.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. This week, Russia is celebrating Victory Day, commemorating the Soviet Union's part in the defeat of Nazi Germany 80 years ago. But is President Putin about to enjoy his own victory if the US pulls out of peace negotiations in effect over the war in Ukraine? Well, one man who thinks President Trump is doing everything in his power to make that happen is the writer and activist Vladimir Kara-Murza, who has in the past been poisoned and imprisoned for his anti-Kremlin campaigns, and he was released in a very dramatic prisoner swap quite recently. The last time we spoke, it was March 2022. Ukraine had just been invaded. I was speaking to you from Ukraine, and I didn't honestly think we would speak again because you were arrested quite shortly afterwards. What is it like to be here ahead of a Russian victory parade that is going to be used for all the propaganda it normally would be?
Well, I didn't think that I would ever speak to anyone. Also, to be completely honest, I was certain I was going to die in that Siberian prison. And that exchange that freed 16 of us, 16 people from the hell of Putin's modern-day gulag last year, was a miracle. That's the only way I can describe it. But it was, in so many ways, a human-made miracle because it was made possible by so many good people in democratic nations who never stopped fighting, never stopped advocating for all those who are locked up in Putin's prisons for having spoken out against this dictatorship and having spoken out against this horrendous war. And today in Russia, we have a record number of political prisoners, more than during the post-Stalin era in the Soviet Union. The Memorial Human Rights Organization recently published a list of known political prisoners, and that's more than 3,000 people. There are many who are unknown, who are not on anybody's list, not on anybody's radars, but even that number is shocking. The whole of the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s had around 700-800 political prisoners. The Soviet Union was 15 countries put together. We are only talking about Russia today, more than 3,000 people. And of course, the fastest growing category on that list are those Russian citizens who are speaking out against Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. It is a criminal offense to speak out against it. And to your second question about the victory parade, look, there's hardly a family in our country that hasn't been touched by the Second World War. My own grandfather was in the war from the summer of 41 when the Soviet Union was invaded by Hitler up until Victory Day in May 45. He was in the Battle of Stalingrad. He was a highly decorated military officer, but he never liked talking about it. Just like he never liked talking about the gulag, which he also survived under Stalin in the 1930s, because just as there's hardly a family in our country that's not been touched by the war, there's also hardly a family in our country that's not been touched by communist repression, by the collectivization, by the purges, by the gulag. And, you know, for people who really do remember this, these were horrendous tragedies. And to the end of his days, my granddad never talked about either the gulag or the war. It's an enormous contrast, you know, to these Putin supporters who drive around Moscow with bumper stickers on their car saying, "We can repeat, we can repeat." No, for people like my grandfather who actually saw this war, it was never again, as opposed to "we can repeat." And so, of course, Victory Day is a very important day. It's a sacred day for a lot of people, not just in Russia, but here in the UK, in the US, you know, in all our allied countries who defeated Hitler together. But when it comes to the Putin regime, we see that, you know, these people just use this as a propaganda gimmick.
Yeah, I mean, history has been twisted, and the modern comparison of defeating the Nazis in Ukraine, as Putin and his acolytes say.
Well, if we actually draw real comparisons, and I'm a historian by education, well, the present-day Hitler, the present-day aggressor in Europe, is Vladimir Putin himself. And the war that he has waged now for more than 3 years, the full-scale war against Ukraine, is the largest military conflict on European soil since the end of the Second World War. And the aggressor here is Vladimir Putin.
When you were arrested, the United States stood with Ukraine. And it was very clear about who the aggressor was. Now, the American President, Trump, believes that Russia was provoked by the actions of the West, and he has effectively backed the Russian narrative.
Well, it's shocking, it's shameful and despicable to see the administration of the United States of America basically parroting the Kremlin's propaganda narrative. And that goes for Donald Trump personally. I mean, he's blamed Ukraine for the start of this war. He referred to Zelensky as a dictator without elections. That's a description that would perfectly fit Vladimir Putin, but not Vladimir Zelensky. As you know, the United States recently voted against Ukraine, together with Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, and other similarly democratic countries at the United Nations General Assembly on the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion. Trump has invited Putin back into the G8. I mean, I don't know where to stop here, but what's important also, it's not just about words, it's also about actions. Remember when after the shameful scene at the White House, the sort of the verbal
humiliation
assault
of Zelensky.
against Zelensky, yes, in the end of February, the United States imposed a so-called pause on military aid to Ukraine, which included a pause in intelligence sharing. And that led to hundreds of casualties because Ukraine was left without intelligence, for example, about where the missiles were coming from. Hundreds of casualties, including civilian casualties. And those are now not only at the conscience of Putin, but also the conscience of Mr. Trump. And we've seen in the last few weeks the United States administration essentially dismantling the system of international assistance, of foreign aid, and Ukraine was the largest recipient of the humanitarian assistance programs in the U.S., but also the destruction of assistance in all the other countries. And we've seen a dismantling of the U.S. system of international broadcasting. Radio stations and media companies like Radio Free Europe or Voice of America. Margarita Simonyan, who's the head of the Kremlin's propaganda TV channel Russia Today, RT, was boasting a few weeks ago on Russian state television that this is an awesome decision by the Americans. We, meaning the Kremlin, couldn't do anything with these media companies for decades and decades. And now, look, the Americans have killed them themselves.
It's a total propaganda victory. But the American plan, such as it was, hasn't worked. Trump's peace in 24 hours has not been delivered.
Or 100 days.
Putin is showing no signs of doing, a peace deal. Does that, in a way, give you hope that the Trump strategy has failed so far?
Well, first of all, it couldn't not fail because we know for almost a century now what the appeasement of an aggressor leads to. It never leads to peace. It leads to more wars. We saw this in the 1930s in Europe, and this country should have particularly learned lessons of this because it was British Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, who sort of spearheaded that policy, and that was a policy that ended in complete disaster and that ended in the Second World War because appeasing an aggressor never leads to peace. It leads to more conflict, more blood, more catastrophe. The only language that regimes like Putin's understand is the language of strength. And when they see weakness, and even more than that, when they see active support, because that's how I would describe the current U.S. policy towards Vladimir Putin's regime, it is support, because what Donald Trump is doing is effectively re-legitimizing Vladimir Putin on the international stage by sending envoys, by opening talks, by inviting him around the table, again, by inviting him into the G8, which he did publicly a few weeks ago. I think it's important to recall that just last year, two largest parliamentary bodies in Europe, one is the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the second is the European Parliament, overwhelmingly passed resolutions recognizing Vladimir Putin for who he is, an illegitimate dictator. In your introduction, Krishnan, you referred to him as President Putin, and I sort of automatically, I had a reaction to that. Yes, because he's not president. He's a dictator. He's been in power for 25 years. We haven't had a free and fair and democratic election in Russia for a quarter of a century. And this is not my opinion. These are the conclusions of international observers from the Council of Europe and the OSCE. Vladimir Putin flagrantly violated not only election standards, we have, as I said, we haven't had a real election in years, but he even violated the very clear constitutional term limit on the presidency that we have in Russia. It's supposed to be 2 terms only. He's been in power for a quarter of a century through these pseudo-legal maneuvers that he's implemented. Well, I'm very happy that the European Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe called a spade, finally called Putin an illegitimate usurper, which he is. But what we see from the other side of the Atlantic is complete opposite of that. Trump is re-legitimizing, or at least trying, I hope Europe doesn't fall for that, but trying to re-legitimize Putin on the international stage, and this is shameful.
I mean, what Trump says, and has said all along, is he's just trying to stop the killing. That the Biden administration failed in this war, and it did. I mean, that's clear. I mean, the Americans didn't supply Ukraine with enough weapons or the weapons that they wanted, and that he's being a realist that territory can't be retaken. Crimea can't realistically be retaken. Even Zelensky says that. I mean, is there no merit at all in his argument and desire to, in his terms, stop the killing?
If we were having this conversation with you in 1937 or 38, perhaps, it would make at least some sense to have this conversation, to debate this. I'm sorry, but after everything we know from history, after the Munich Agreement, after the results of 25 years of Western appeasement of Vladimir Putin, this is where it led us. Because for years and years and years, while Putin was already destroying democracy in Russia, shutting down independent media, jailing his opponents, rigging elections, turning parliament into a rubber stamp, violently dispersing peaceful opposition rallies and so on, Western leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, that doesn't just go for America, that goes for leaders of Europe as well. Tony Blair, for example, courted Vladimir Putin for a long time. Western leaders continued to do business as usual with this dictator. I suppose in the hope that they could find some sort of a modus operandi with him on the international stage by turning a blind eye on the repressive abuses at home. But apart from being immoral, this policy is very impractical, because one thing we clearly know from the history of Russia is that domestic repression and external aggression are two sides of the same coin. A regime that does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people is not going to respect the civilized norms of international behavior. And so what is happening today, this horrendous war in Ukraine, is partly a result of years and years of Western enabling, Western appeasement of Vladimir Putin, instead of the policy of principle that he should have conducted. How is more appeasement, more enabling going to help that?
How do you think the Trump perspective or narrative can be turned around? I mean, we're seeing some Republicans contradicting him. We're seeing Mike Pence contradicting him. The Democrats are very clear where they stand. What do you think can be done to change his position? Or is it Putin who will ultimately do that by humiliating him?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to state that with everything that the current US president is doing, the United States of America has voluntarily renounced its role as the leader of the free world, as it has been known for decades and decades. And so I believe it's now really incumbent on Europe to take up that mantle, to take up that role, and to lead on the position of principle. Nothing, I don't think.
I mean, Europe can lead on principle. It can't lead on money and hardware and clout.
Well, first of all, European assistance to Ukraine put together is bigger than American assistance. The Americans are trying to say the opposite, but that's not true. But I think ultimately what is very important for the free world to understand, and primarily for Europe, because the largest European country is Russia. We all live in the same continent. We are neighbors. I think it's very important for European countries, including the UK, to understand that the only way to really solve this crisis, the only way to really end this war, the only way to really ensure long-term peace, stability, and security, not just for Ukraine, but for the European continent as a whole, is for Russia to become a normal, democratic country. Because as we know very clearly from our history, internal repression and external aggression go hand in hand. For as long as Putin remains in power, for as long as we have this authoritarian, dictatorial, autocratic, repressive regime in the Kremlin that will disregard and trample upon the rights and freedoms of our own people, it is always going to remain aggressive in its foreign policy goals. It's always going to remain dangerous for our neighbors and for other countries. The only long-term strategic solution is to have a democratic Russia. That should be the goal. It's important to set that goal. Do you remember in Alice in the Wonderland in Lewis Carroll, there's a scene when Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go? And the Cheshire Cat responds, well, that very much depends on where you want to get to. I think that is the goal that should be absolutely clear to everyone. Because for now, and I'm very dismayed by this, Krishnan, and I have to say, we have these two polar extremes when it comes to Western approach to Russia. One polar extreme is the one that we're discussing with you. It's sort of the Trump, Orban, Fico line. Let's go back to business with Putin. Let's make deals with him. Let's bring him back to the international arena, which, for all the reasons we've been discussing, is completely unacceptable, shameful, and immoral, and also very counterproductive. But there's another polar extreme that I sometimes hear from some European Union politicians that, all these Russians, they're genetic slaves. They've always lived under autocracy. They can't do democracy. That let's just sort of dismiss them all. This is what I'm sorry. First of all, this is insulting. But secondly, this is not true, because no nation is genetically insane. I mean, it's really it's really enraging that in the 21st century to be hearing arguments like this. And this is borderline racism. And both of these polar extremes are unacceptable, both the enabling and the appeasement of Putin and this sort of anti-Russian bigotry, not anti-Putin, but anti-Russian, that we hear from some people in the West. And I think the right way, and the only way, if we do want to see a Europe whole, free and at peace one day, is for the Western world, for the free world, to be sending a message to Russian society, to those millions of people inside of Russia who oppose Putin, who oppose this war of aggression, that we hear you and that our fight is not with you, the Russian people. Our fight was this aggressive, murderous Kremlin dictatorship, and that there will be a place around the table for a free and democratic Russia, and that life for the Russian people will be better after and without Putin than it is today. This is what leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, those are the messages they sent to people living behind the Iron Curtain in the Cold War times. But that is not, unfortunately, what we're hearing today.
I mean, the trouble is that the Western democracies do not have a great track record of taking democracy anywhere. And people are scarred by that. And they also know that Putin has got popular support amongst the sector of Russian society, and whether the elections are rigged or not, he does get votes.
Oh, I'm sorry, Krishnan. I mean, I know you're a journalist and you have to ask these questions, but seriously, we're talking about support in elections in a dictatorship where you go to prison for opposing the government? Really? How can you measure support? The last time we had anything approaching on free and fair election was in 2000. Now we're speaking with you in 2025. We have a whole generation that has grown up in Russia, not once seeing what a real election looks like. And again, that's not my personal view. Go and read the reports of international observers from the OSCE or the Council of Europe. This is their verdict. How can you talk about elections when the two main leaders of the opposition, Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, have been murdered by Putin? How can we talk about elections when even cautious anti-war candidates, somebody like Boris Nadezhdin, who tried to run in a presidential election last year, and we saw hundreds of thousands of people all over Russia standing in long queues at his campaign offices to sign the ballot petitions to get him on the ballot. We saw this sort of amazing awakening that destroyed all the lies constructed for so long by Putin's propaganda, who tried to persuade the whole world that, as you just said, that yes, Russians support Putin, Russians support the war.
But is it practically deliverable? I mean, you've been making this argument for a long time. You went back to Russia to make this argument, and you were imprisoned.
Yes, many people are imprisoned. And you know, there are many people who are imprisoned today, and there are people who are imprisoned in the Soviet system. And then that system collapsed in 3 days in August 1991. And you know, we know, again, I'm a historian by education, the arc of history, you know, may not bend as fast as we'd like, but it does bend towards liberty. There's absolutely no question about it. If you look at the map of Europe, let's say 40 years ago, which is nothing by historical standards, it's like yesterday morning, you will see that half of the countries on the European continent were living under some sort of authoritarian, autocratic, dictatorial regimes. Fast forward to today, you look at the map of Europe, there are only two dictatorships left. It's Putin's Russia and Lukashenko's Belarus. The trend is clear. The trend is unmistakable. Of course, Russia will be a democracy. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. But I think it is incumbent on all people of goodwill, both in Russia, but also in the free world, first of all, to have that goal, to have that objective, as in reference to Lewis Carroll, and also to work towards it. And to do, for example, exactly the opposite of what Donald Trump is doing by destroying the system of international democracy assistance, by destroying these media companies that were, you know, the last sources of independent
information. Isn't that
information.
the trend? I mean, you say the trend is, you know, the curve is always towards democracy. The curve right now is towards populist leaders, you know, all around the world who do not necessarily respect democratic norms.
Well, I think this is what distinguishes politicians from historians, and I'm fortunate to be both, because historians have a much longer periods of time that they judge. Yes, we have seen in the last few years, unquestionably, the rise of the populist movements, including here in the UK with these local elections that just happened. But if you look at the way history marches, history moves, it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Always, always, always. Whatever country we look at, whatever period of time we look at. I'm talking about modern history, of course, the last few centuries, not the Middle Ages. So this is the step back. But we still know that 2 forward and 1 back, that's still progress, that still goes forward. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Russia will be a democracy, because no people are genetic slaves, because no people is destined to live under autocratic dictatorial rule. But it's a question of the free world standing in solidarity with all those people in Russia who want that different vision, just like people of the generation of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher did. They never dismissed people living behind the Iron Curtain as genetic slaves. In fact, President Reagan, speaking here in London, his famous Westminster address in 1982, He said it is cultural condescension or worse meaning racism, to suggest that there's a single nation on this earth that would voluntarily choose dictatorship over democracy. That is as true today as it was 4 decades ago. And we should hear more of this from the free world, from the leaders of the free world, instead of hearing calls either to go back to business as usual with an aggressive dictator, Vladimir Putin, or dismissing, the whole Russian people, supposedly that they all support the war, that they all support Putin. Both of those ways are completely wrong. There should be something in the middle.
Can we talk about your own experience? When I spoke to you last, you had already been poisoned twice. These had been serious attempts on your life, and yet you were going back. You must have known that you were taking your life in your hands at that stage.
Look, I'm a Russian politician. A politician has to be in his or her own country, can't work any other way. What moral right would I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up to the Putin dictatorship if I was too afraid to do this myself? I do believe that those people who aspire to be political leaders, those people who aspire to be the public faces of the democratic movement, have a level of responsibility that frankly outweighs considerations of personal comfort, of personal safety. And I've always felt this way. And I also think, and I fundamentally believe, and this is actually, to me, this was the most important lesson of the Soviet dissident movement, that fear, at the end of the day, is a personal choice. Yes, regimes like the Soviet regime, like the Putin regime, they will seek to rule by fear. They will seek to instill fear, that this is how they stay in power. But at the end of the day, it is up to each individual person to decide whether he or she chooses to be afraid or not. And I do believe it is important that when people are starting to be afraid, the politicians have to come in, stand next to them, and say, here I am. I'm not afraid.
How were you not afraid? How did you control your fear?
I was afraid. I'm an alive human being. I'm not a robot. I'm not a Superman. But as a great American leader, Senator John McCain once said, courage is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to act despite our fears. We all are afraid. I think the Soviet dissidents were afraid when they spoke out against the Soviet regime and went to prison for it. This is, fear is a natural human sentiment. But this is what feeds these dictatorial regimes. They rule by fear. They feed on fear. They survive in power because of fear. And yes, I do believe that at the end of the day, it's each individual person's choice whether or not to be afraid. And those of us who are the public faces of the opposition movement, who are the politicians in Russia, we have to show by personal example that we must not be afraid. And so there was never even a question of leaving Russia for me, just as there was no question for Ilya Yashin, for example, who was in the same exchange with me last year. And when they kicked us out of the country in this exchange last August, nobody asked for opinion once. They just herded us all on the plane like cattle and threw us out into Turkey.
How did you deal with your fear in prison once you had been locked up?
Oh, in prison, the fear goes away because you know that you're right. This was really important. Many years ago, 20 years ago now, I made a documentary film about Soviet dissidents, which was called They Chose Freedom. I wanted to show the story of these remarkable, amazing people who had the strength and the courage and the conscience to stand up to this repressive, dictatorial, criminal regime. And one of the people I interviewed for this film was Vladimir Bukovsky, a legendary Soviet-era dissident, writer who spent many, many years in a Soviet gulag. And I asked him what helped him survive in prisons and labor camps and psychiatric prisons that he was in the Soviet times too. And I was expecting some sort of a long and drawn-out response, but he just looked at me and said, I knew that I was right. I knew that I was right. And at the time I thought these are just nice-sounding words. And of course I put them in the film because they sounded good. But having gone through prison myself, I can appreciate just how important that is, the knowledge that you're right. Because, whatever words were written in these indictments and in these sentences and all these so-called official documents, at every moment of every day that I spent in that prison, first in Moscow and then in Siberia, I knew that I was right and the people in the Kremlin are wrong. I knew that the real criminals are those people who are sitting in the Kremlin and who have started this war, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it. And that knowledge that you're right is very, very important. When you know that you're right, the doubt and the fear just go away.
Were you not afraid that they were going to kill you?
You keep sort of going back to this notion of being afraid. You can't afford to be afraid in prison because you're not going to survive. You have to just collect yourself, And again, the knowledge that you're right really helps. And you cannot show weakness, and you cannot show emotion. I mean, there's been tons of literature written about this.
But there's what you show and there's what you feel. And obviously, as a politician, you don't show fear, as you explained, but of course you feel it. And surely in prison, knowing what that regime has done to others, people who were close to you, knowing what they had done to you, you must have thought they're going to do it again.
As I've said at the beginning of our conversation, I was certain I was never getting out of that Siberian prison, yes. But I also knew that I was right. I also knew that there are many people in Russia who think like we do, who support what we do. I received thousands of letters from all over the country when I was in prison, from all over the world too, but from all over Russia, from people I'd never met, from cities and towns I'd never been to, some of them I haven't even heard of. People who took the time and who took the risk to write to a political prisoner through the official prison's correspondence system, because that's the only way you can write to prisoners, to say that they feel the same way as I do about this regime, about this war. And this public solidarity was very important. The solidarity of people in the free world, including so many members of parliament here in Britain from different political parties, who stood up in parliament and asked questions and made statements and submitted resolutions. This may not sound like a big deal for somebody who just walks on his or her own on the streets, but I have to say that when you sit in this 2 by 3 meter cell in solitary confinement at a maximum security prison in Siberia, it's really important to know that the free world stands in solidarity with us. And so every time I have an opportunity to speak before a Western Parliament, as I have this opportunity here now on the trip to London, and any other Western capital, I always I always plead with Western political leaders to please continue talking about political prisoners in Russia, about political prisoners in Belarus, about political prisoners in countries where speaking out against the government is a criminal offense. Because as Irwin Cotler, the former Justice Minister of Canada, one of the world's foremost advocates for human rights, once said, the worst nightmare for a political prisoner is to be forgotten. And whatever else I felt when I was in prison, not for a second did I think I was forgotten. And this was important for survival. And we have to make sure that the political prisoners, thousands of political prisoners who remain in Putin's gulag today, are not forgotten, that people stand in solidarity with them, that people talk about them, and, very importantly, that any coming ceasefire agreement in the Ukraine war includes a provision on the release of all the captives of this war, meaning thousands of Ukrainian civilian hostages who've been captured by Russian forces, meaning thousands of Ukrainian children who've been abducted by Russian forces, and meaning Russian political prisoners who are only jailed because they have opposed this war. All these people have to be part of any ceasefire agreement, because all we hear about now, are assets, territories, sanctions, rare earth minerals, whatever, but we're not hearing about people. And people are the biggest victims of this war. We cannot bring back the hundreds of thousands of lives lost because of Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine, but it's still possible to save the tens of thousands of lives who are captives of this war, both Ukrainian and Russian, and these people have to be saved.
How much did you know at the time? I mean, it's sort of surprising that you knew what was going on and that you knew you were not alone, because you would think they would want to isolate you.
I had snippets. I was isolated. I was in solitary confinement. I couldn't speak to anybody. I couldn't, I could only get out of my cell for 1 hour a day, and that was just this small exercise yard, which was not much bigger than a cell, except instead of the ceiling, you had the metal bars, so it was possible to see a little bit of the sky. That was the only difference. And it was total isolation, and I have to say it's really difficult, because, there's a reason why international law, United Nations rules on the treatment of prisoners stipulate that 15 days or more in solitary confinement is officially considered a form of torture. And I've spent nearly a year in solitary confinement, other two and a half years I've been in prison. So it was isolation, but I had letters, as I said, and obviously these were censored by the prison authorities, and often I would get letters with whole lines blacked out. Very often the letters wouldn't get through, and my responses to them wouldn't get through. But many did, and it was a very important source of moral support. So that's why I always, ask people, please do not forget, please remember, please write to political prisoners. I think only somebody who's been through this experience can appreciate how much hope and how much warmth and how much light there can be in that small piece of paper that the prison guard hands you through the feeding slot in your cell door at 4 p.m. every day.
While you were in prison, your wife, Evgenia, came in here and everywhere and spoke for you. Did you have any sense of that? Did you think that she would have done that?
Oh, I had no doubt you've done that because, we've been together for more than 20 years and we finish each other's sentences, as it were. We know each other better than anybody else knows us. And I'm very fortunate to have not just a wife, but my best friend as well. And she was, of course, I didn't have the full scope of what she was doing, but I knew she was doing everything that she could. And I know how good she is. And you know that, having interviewed her, she's amazing. She was the one who got me out. It was the tireless advocacy. It was going around the world while I was in prison, campaigning, speaking, giving interviews, meeting these members of parliaments and members of governments, which of course also meant that our 3 children basically had no parents for 2.5 years because I was in prison and she was always on the road. But she was the one who got me out, along with so many people of good faith, of goodwill, who never stopped. But now she told me recently, she was also really tired of all this. So she said, I got you out of prison, now you go and do it yourself. So here we are talking with you.
Yeah, and you are doing it yourself. I see a lot of people in your position might have said, okay, I've done it, and I can't put myself and my family at risk anymore. But you're carrying on.
Look, the goal is a democratic Russia. The goal is a peaceful, civilized, democratic European Russia that would respect our own people and that would be a peaceful and predictable and secure neighbor to all other European countries. And obviously this goal is still not achieved, to put it mildly. And I'm never going to stop for as long as we continue this work.
But the Russian state has killed people in this country. It reaches well beyond its borders. What impact does that have on your life?
I just don't think about this. That's a sure road to paranoia, and that's certainly not the way I want to go. So I just don't think about this. I know, again, that what I'm doing is right. I know that what I'm doing is necessary. I know that what I'm doing is supported by a lot of people in Russia and around the world. And I'm just going to carry on doing it regardless.
And do you believe you'll go back?
I am certain that I will go back. I have absolutely no doubt. It's only a question of time. Every dictatorship ends. Every autocratic regime falls. The Russian people are no worse and no better than any other people in the world. They're just as capable of living in a democratic state as people in this country and so many other countries around our planet. And I have absolutely no doubt that Russia will be a democracy. I have absolutely no doubt that I will be back in my home country. And I think it's going to happen much sooner than people may think about it today.
Do you have a sense of the mechanism now? I mean, at the moment, Putin has control. And he has the geopolitical support, effectively, of Trump. He's back in the tent. So what is the mechanism for Democrats in Russia?
Well, look, the Russian Empire also had control, and the Soviet Union had control, and then both collapsed in 3 days, literally. Both the Tsarist regime in March 1917 and the communist regime in August 1991 collapsed in 3 days, literally, not a figure of speech. This is how things happen in Russia. Nobody has ever predicted major political change in our country, let alone the mechanism by which it would happen. It happens at a snap of a finger. And so the most important task, as I see it, for us in the Russian democratic opposition today, is be preparing ourselves for the day after Putin. And that's also a very important task, in my view, for Western leaders.
Because there isn't a democratic culture.
There is. This is absolutely a false statement. Because
but culture is the wrong word. What I mean is there are not functioning political parties in Russia that can operate.
Absolutely. But we do have a history of democracy. This is absolutely false to suggest that Russia never had democracy. In fact, if we look at the history of Russia, let's say for the past 5 centuries or so, we would see a constant conflict between the autocratic tradition, which is certainly there, nobody's denying that, but also a constitutional democratic tradition, which raised its head, as early as the 15th century under Tsar Ivan III, and then again, of course, with the Saltykov constitution in the early 17th century, with the Decembrist uprising in the early 19th century, and of course the constitutional monarchy, parliament, political freedoms we had in the early 20th century and the 1990s, with the period I grew up in. And I saw what it's like to have competitive elections. I saw what it's like to have a real parliament in Russia. I saw what it's like to have independent free press. So we do have those traditions, just as we have autocratic traditions. But the point is that because political changes in Russia happen so swiftly and so unexpectedly, as they always did before, nobody's prepared for that. And by nobody, I mean our own society, but also people in the outside world. And that is why so many mistakes were made in the 1990s, both domestically and internationally, the mistakes that led us to the point where we are today. And so every time in these last few months since my release from prison, I've had meetings with heads of state and government on both sides of the Atlantic, including with Prime Minister Starmer here in London. I've always started this conversation with the issue of political prisoners, and I always ask Western leaders not to forget and to stand in solidarity with those people in Russia who are in prison because of their opposition to the war and to Putin. But the second issue in all these conversations was always that it is important to be preparing for the day after Putin. It is important to have a plan, a roadmap, a strategy for the day after Putin, because none of us knows when it's going to happen. None of us knows how it's going to happen. What we do know, judging by our past experience, is it's going to happen quickly and unexpectedly. And when it does happen, it's going to be too late to start thinking and reflecting and preparing. We have to have those plans in place now, because Russia's too big, Russia's too important. What happens in Russia affects everybody, as I think the world sees very clearly in the last 3.5 years. And so it is in everyone's interest that the next time we have a window of opportunity for democratic change in Russia, it is successful, that democratic transition is successful, and that Russia does finally become a normal, peaceful, civilized, democratic European country. It's not going to happen on its own. There's going to be a lot of work to be done, and we need to be preparing for that work now.
And when it comes to Ukraine, you said Europe needs to step in where America has stepped out. In practical terms, that means a huge amount of money needs to be replaced that America could stop spending. So what case do you make to British politicians and the people who are struggling, whose own economy is in a mess still, when you say, actually, you need to invest in this?
Because it affects everyone, because we all live on the same planet, and we also live on the same continent. Yes, I know the UK is an island, but you're still very close, and you're still a European country. And we know that what happens in one part of Europe affects everybody, especially when it's something as significant as the largest conflict on European soil since the Second World War, which this is. And when I'm talking about Europe stepping up and leading on a position of principle, I'm talking first and foremost about making sure that any ceasefire deal, which looks very likely to be concluded in the next few months, but, if we just entrust that to the American administration, they're not going to care about principles, they're not going to care about values, they're not going to care about people. So it is up for Europe to ensure, including the UK, to ensure that any such deal, I'm not calling it a peace deal, because there will only be real peace once Putin's out of power. This is only a temporary ceasefire. But that any temporary ceasefire deal includes real security guarantees, real security provisions for Ukraine, ensuring that Putin doesn't repeat this, next year or in a couple of years. And also, as we've already touched on with you, that any such deal must include the provision to release all the people who are held captive because of this war, both in Russia, both Russians and Ukrainians. This is the most important thing we can do, because any deal made while Putin's in power is by definition temporary. But for many of these people who are held hostage or held in captivity, Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian kids, Russian political prisoners, for so many of them, it's not only a question of unjust and politically motivated imprisonment, it is very often a question of life or death. And many of these people will not survive until the end of the Putin regime, when everybody will be released. And they have to be released now, because we know that the Americans under the current administration will not be talking about this. All they talk about is rare earth minerals and money. It is incumbent for Europe to stand up on this and to lead from a position of principle. And this is what I mean first and foremost, to ensure that any deal includes real security guarantees for Ukraine and includes a provision of releasing all the captives of this war, Russians and Ukrainians alike.
Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
That's it for this edition of the Fourcast. Until next time, bye-bye.